Hello, everybody. Welcome remotely from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. My name is Amanda Cucci, and today's webinar is titled Natural Disturbance-Based Silviculture Strategies, Adaptation, and Wildlife Outcomes. And we are excited to have Dr. Tony D'Amato from the University of Vermont with us today. We'll be introducing him in just a moment, but first I'd like to remind you of a few logistical details. Thank you for tuning in today for our webinar series held in partnership with the Forest Ecology Working Group, as well as the Science Applications in Migratory Birds Program and the National Conservation Training Center. Thank you also to the Forest Service and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science in sponsoring this webinar series. CEU credits are available for this series. Please contact Jim Siegel if you would like credit using the email on the screen, which I will also add in the chat box here in a few minutes. As a disclaimer, the product is for educational purposes only. The views, opinions, or positions expressed in this webinar series are those of the guest presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or positions of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the Department of the Interior. Some of the materials and images may be protected by copyright or may have been licensed to us by a third party or restricted in their use. Mention of any product names, companies, web links, textbooks, or other references does not imply federal endorsement. This webinar is being recorded live and all of you are active participants. Whether you are listening by phone or computer, you are currently on mute during this presentation for the enjoyment of others. If you have any questions, please enter them using the chat box and be sure to choose Send Chat to All. Please also feel free to enter questions at any point during the presentation. We will pause to take questions halfway through the presentation as well as at the end. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on the webinar gallery a few days after this live presentation ends. If you wish to change your presentation view, you can access different view modes in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, as shown on this slide. I am now going to turn you over to Maria to tell us a little bit more about the series, as well as introduce our wonderful speaker today. Take it away, Maria.
Hello, everyone. My name is Maria Genoviak, and I'm the Acting Director of the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science with the USDA Forest Service. And I'm one of the organizers of the webinar series, and I'm really happy to see so many people here today and really appreciate you joining us. Just to give you a bit of a context, this is part of a 12-part, year-long webinar series. And when we developed this, we really intended to tell a story about climate change, its impacts on forest ecosystems, and how that affects forest-dependent wildlife species. Throughout the course of this particular webinar series, we're examining forest ecosystems and their composition and structure in regard to climate change, how these influence wildlife populations and carbon dynamics. We really want this to be helpful to natural resource practitioners and land managers, and so we're highlighting management tools and approaches that can help facilitate forest and wildlife climate adaptation at landscape and at stand scales. And I'll drop a link for the webinar series in the chat. All right. So in terms of this particular series, today we're going to be joined by Tony D'Amato from the University of Vermont, and I'll introduce him briefly. I also wanted to highlight, and you can see through that link, the entire webinar series, to have you mark your calendars for October 18th for next month, where we'll have Dawn Magnus from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska talk about strategies for forest climate adaptation and decision making. And so this is really great. Tony is going to talk to us right kind of at the nexus of thinking about pivoting from climate change impacts presentations that we've had, moving us over into adaptation strategies. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Tony D'Amato. He will be talking about the intersection of silviculture, climate adaptation, and wildlife today. So this is really fantastic. Tony is a professor of silviculture and applied forest ecology, and also the director of the forestry program at the University of Vermont. And he's done a really wide array of research that's at the cutting edge of climate change adaptation. And so this will be a really great opportunity to hear his wealth of knowledge, and I expect that we'll cover a lot of ground in this presentation. I will be monitoring the chat to ask questions of Tony kind of halfway through the presentation and at the end. And so do please feel free to put those into the chat. I'll monitor those and moderate the questions. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Tony.
Thanks, Maria. Let me get my screen up here. All right, it's coming through okay. So thanks everybody for logging in today. Thanks Maria and Amanda for your help with the webinar series here. Really appreciate people and the interest that there are in these topics, because certainly it's a real challenge that we're facing here as it relates to how to sustain forests as we move into the future, both from a disturbance perspective as well as in terms of climate change. And so what I'll be talking about today really is emphasizing maybe a historic approach for thinking about forest management. And so my task for the day was to talk about natural disturbance-based silviculture and how that links both to sustaining wildlife populations, as well as some of the connections that exist between these approaches that we often might think of as ecological silviculture and adaptation strategies in response to both climate change and, again, changing disturbance regimes. So what I'll do for today is really talk a bit about the past, and in particular, really talk a lot about disturbance ecology for kind of primary forest conditions here in North America and elsewhere around the globe, and draw the linkages that certainly were drawn in previous webinars between the disturbance processes, the conditions they create, and what that means in terms of wildlife habitat. And then building from that, get into why that matters as a real key template for guiding our management for wildlife species. And so using approaches that are often referred to as natural disturbance-based silvicultural systems. And I'll provide some examples of what that looks like, as well as end by talking a bit about how that links up with adaptation strategies and some of the things that the remainder of the webinar series are going to cover this year. So the first thing I want to talk about is really to provide a broad framing for how we think about both designing silvicultural strategies, but more importantly, kind of the variety that we have across both the US and really around the globe in terms of both forest conditions and, more importantly, the disturbance regimes that characterize them. And so I'm going to go through kind of a review of what we call these disturbance archetypes. And so essentially kind of these model forest systems that really are influenced by certain prevailing disturbance regimes that have a strong impact on the things that we care about from both a wildlife perspective, but also the adaptation mechanisms that might exist within those ecosystems. And so some of you might be familiar with some of the main forest archetypes. This is not a shameless plug for this textbook. It's actually more to give credit to the others that came up with these ideas. And so Brian Palick and Jerry Franklin and others have really formalized this idea of disturbance archetypes. And so thinking about forests in terms of the prevailing disturbance regimes and what that might mean, both in terms of the key ecological processes that characterize those forests, but also when we think about management and restoration and adaptation, what silvicultural strategies and other approaches might make the most sense. And so the other reason for showing this textbook is if you disagree with these four archetypes, you can blame the other authors. There's a lot of variability out there in terms of where forests fit in terms of disturbance regime, but we basically think about forests of falling into four broad categories, and I'll talk more about each of these in a moment, but those that are initiated by infrequent but severe disturbance, so kind of large-scale severe wildfire, those that are characterized by frequent low-severity disturbance, primarily surface fire, those that really are characterized more by gap-scale disturbance, primarily wind, and then those that we consider more of a mixed severity disturbance regime. And again, there's variation certainly across these classes, but often a useful framework for thinking about the diverse ecosystems you might have in a landscape or certainly across the US and elsewhere. So the ones that certainly get the most attention, I always talk about, where I live, none of our disturbances make the news, but if you live in a part of the world where, infrequent severe disturbance is the predominant disturbance regime, you tend to be what the national and the international media often covers. And so these are forest types that really are dominated by a disturbance regime where we have stand replacement disturbances that occur at a frequency that's actually shorter than the maximum lifespan of the trees in that forest. So as a result, when there is a disturbance event, it's often a stand-wide high mortality event that creates a high number of legacies. And so what we're looking at here is kind of this pre-forest legacy creation stage on the left, these dead trees corresponding to that post-disturbance condition. And that really has a strong influence on the development of this forest for many decades, if not centuries, just given the role that mature trees and those mature tree legacies provide. Unlike other systems, we often think of this as being ecosystem types that accumulate complexity over time, both through kind of fine scale mortality processes and gap scale events. And so Douglas fir forests are often ones we think of fitting into this mold, depending on where you are climatically. But other forests like jack pine, lodgepole pine, where these stand replacing events are the dominant character, are what we'd often think of as these infrequent severe disturbance regimes. On the other end of the spectrum, many of you work in areas where frequent low severity fire in particular are the predominant regimes. And so in contrast to infrequent severe regimes, these are ones where we actually are accumulating kind of patchworks and mosaics of complexity over time through surface fire events, bark beetles, depending on where you are, armillaria, root disease. And what this creates is a mosaic, often woodland-like structure that really is maintained by frequent fire events, ranging anywhere from 1 to 20 years in frequency, and certainly really influenced historically by traditional burning by indigenous peoples, but really creating a much more open woodland-like structure that those that are familiar with these forests know support some of the most diverse understory communities out there in terms of forest systems. And so just floristically quite diverse, and then structurally quite diverse systems. Moving into my part of the world and where I tend to exist, the disturbances that don't make the news, really a lot of our temperate mesic systems, particularly in our humid environments, as well as we get into higher montane systems, where we now get into ecosystems where the frequency of stand replacing disturbances is actually much longer than the lifespan of the dominant trees. And so as a result, the prevailing disturbance regimes that we tend to see and tend to think of in influencing structure are gap scale, kind of fine scale disturbances. So this profile you're looking at here is an old growth forest in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. So there's a lot of fine scale heterogeneity, canopy openings, differences in tree sizes. And these forests often are characterized both by uneven aged forest conditions, as well as dominance by shade tolerance, all things that are affected by those gap scale events. And again, certainly there can be some variety with mesoscale events also occurring, but gap scale being the predominant mode. And finally, something that's talked about quite a bit in the previous webinar, and certainly one that's received increasing attention as we think about piecing through kind of the variability that exists in our fire-dependent ecosystems. We also have this archetype that we consider what we call heavy partial disturbance or mixed severity disturbance regimes, often driven by fire, where we have both a mix of fire behavior with a single event or accumulated differences in fire behavior through partial fire, surface fire events, as well as some more stand scale events that generate, again, often multi-age conditions at multiple scales and create quite a mosaic across the landscape in terms of what we might see for forest structure. We can also have mixed severity regimes in some of our kind of temperate hardwoods, where we have tornadoes and other events also creating pretty important intermediate disturbances. And so these four archetypes, like I mentioned, give you kind of a range of what we might expect for a given region, for a given kind of sub-region, depending on where you're existing in the landscape and what you might have for a variety in forest type. But they're meant to give at least a broad template for how we think about forests operating and what the general disturbance regimes are and what that does in terms of impacting structure. And so the reason for talking about those archetypes is that when we're thinking about wildlife responses to disturbance and trying to evaluate the best strategies for kind of influencing wildlife species of interest and using disturbance as a model, what we're really interested in is really factoring in what are the factors that disturbance is affecting that is influencing wildlife populations. And so things like food, certainly availability of shelter, water, other dynamics, as well as predator prey and nest cover and so forth. And so how do we think through those elements and how they're being influenced by disturbance? And so what we really are going to talk a lot about today in terms of looking at disturbances and how that might influence both what we do from a silvicultural standpoint for natural disturbance emulation as well as for adaptation, is that one of the key things that really influences wildlife populations is what does a given disturbance regime leave behind? And so a lot of emphasis has certainly been placed over the decades on biological legacies, the living as well as dead organisms that are left behind, kind of large organic, kind of inherited legacies from the previous disturbance forest into kind of the newly disturbed ecosystem. And from a perspective of wildlife populations, these certainly can represent pretty unique habitat features. And we'll talk a bit more about the response of woodpeckers and other species too, both structures being created as well as structures surviving on those disturbances. And so those legacies are certainly a key aspect of how we look at disturbance and its impacts on wildlife populations. At the same time, ooh, that really cranked the head. Disturbance also creates different conditions, and in particular, disturbances creating available growing space, and as a result, often creating the opportunity for new species to establish, whether those are herbaceous plants or berry-producing species that are important sources of food, or creating new cohorts, or creating kind of a juxtaposition of old versus young, and doing that at multiple spatial scales that, again, all of you on the webinar, that's certainly far better wildlife experts than me, understand are some of the conditions that are necessary for supporting both specific wildlife species, but also supporting a diversity of wildlife species across the landscape. And so what I'm going to get into is talking about some just basic principles. Again, many of you are already well aware of kind of how disturbance, whether it be management or natural disturbance, affects the structure and composition of forests. But I'm going to talk a bit about just what that means in terms of which species might be favored, and really use that as a way to crosswalk us into then ultimately talking about why we actually manage to emulate those disturbances. If we care about trying to conserve these species, we're trying to emulate some of those processes that actually supported them naturally under different disturbance regimes. So I'm going to start with a fairly simplistic cartoon that came from a recent paper in Environmental Reviews that really talks a lot about fire refugia and patches of trees, as well as individual trees surviving kind of fire disturbance. And so this is one of the figures from that paper. And on the right, I have some examples of kind of that heterogeneity we often see following wildfire, where within kind of a burned area, and so this pink blob is kind of the burned area, we're going to have kind of some larger kind of skips or areas that aren't burned, as well as some individual trees that might survive. And certainly not just two of those, often kind of a mosaic of different sizes and configurations of these different patches. And so from the perspective of wildlife behavior and response, oftentimes what we're looking at those large kind of unburned areas, so that what they're calling unburnt patches of soil, as really representing the potential to sustain some of those species that may have been present prior to disturbance. And so species that might rely on more mature structures, maybe more well-developed canopy conditions. And so oftentimes when we have these larger reserve patches, these are the places where we still might have well-developed advanced regeneration, multiple canopy layers, and things that might sustain, whether it's wood warblers or marten or other species that require that habitat. Likewise, as many of us all are well aware of, we'll have scattered kind of surviving trees, as well as scattered, dead trees that serve also as kind of tree level refugia for certain species, whether it be kind of lichens and bryophytes that might persist on kind of living trees that survive on these disturbances, or bird species that rely on those kind of surviving trees as kind of key perch sites or other aspects of their behavior. And so these legacies of disturbance, it's not anything new, really can influence what comes back on a site, and importantly kind of influence that we now have a juxtaposition of both mature structures with a young developing forest, creating a wide range of habitat niches for species. And so if we look at research that examines disturbance responses of wildlife species, like everything else, it really depends. And as all of us know, kind of a basic principle of wildlife biology is we can't manage for every species in the exact same spot at the exact same time, right? Everything has different needs, different requirements. And really, when we're looking at natural disturbance impacts, you can see, how that influences the abundance of certain conditions that may or may not favor certain species depending on their habitat requirements. And so what this figure is depicting is 6 different species. This was a meta-analysis for North America that looked at studies that examined kind of the response to high severity natural fires, low to moderate severity natural fires, forests where they thinned to kind of be a surrogate for fire, so kind of restoration and thinning, and likewise restoration and thinning, that as well as the inclusion of prescribed burning. And so they didn't have that situation for every single one of these species. But you can get a sense just based on these bars, kind of where each species resides. And so species that are kind of to the right of this dashed line had a positive response to that disturbance. Those to the left had a negative response. And so again, doesn't take rocket science to kind of sort this through, but it's worth just reflecting on that. Depending on the requirements of those forest-dependent species, they may or may not have been favored by the conditions created by fire disturbance. And so species like ovenbirds, it's a ground nesting species, the consumption of the duff layer, the consumption of kind of a low shrub layer is going to impact their abundance, and they negatively were affected by wildfire. Similarly, yellow rump warbler, species requiring kind of a canopy, for foraging and so forth, trees get burned and removed, you no longer have those opportunities. On the flip side, all of us know, woodpecker responses are often quite pronounced when we have a lot of trees killed by fire. And so species like hairy woodpecker, as well as a cavity nester like western bluebird, also showing positive responses to those disturbances. Whereas a golden-mouthed mantle ground squirrel, what we're seeing here is this is a species that those of you familiar with this that really does well in kind of the open woodland-like conditions that are maintained by forests that have frequent low-severity fire regimes. And so when we have a combination of thinning, so reducing the density of that stand, as well as reintroducing fire, it creates those conditions that the species is responding to. And so really giving you a sense for, and again, many of you appreciate this, that depending on both the severity of the disturbance, but also kind of the nature of canopy mortality and how it's implemented, it's going to influence which species are finding which type of habitat. Similarly, looking at it through the perspective of wind disturbance, what we're seeing here is some work that was done in Sweden, examining kind of the response of bird communities to hurricane events. And so giving us an opportunity to look at another kind of stand level and landscape level event, but very different than fire in its impact. And so this graph on the left is just showing a community index value for different guilds of species. And essentially the lines on the first few years are kind of pre-disturbance measurements. And so then when we reach these red dots, that's when the actual hurricane occurred. And so for ground nesting species, you'll notice that after that hurricane occurred, there was an increase in the abundance of ground nesters that was sustained. And really what they're responding to is this accumulation of dead woody debris, these piles of wood that occur following hurricane events that really are providing key nesting structures for those species, as well as certainly those tip-up mounds, and then what those are providing in terms of a unique structure. Cavity nesters, similar trend initially. There was an increase with kind of the initial mortality of trees, but that actually declined. Those familiar with kind of the nature of cavity formation and snag creation, kind of a burned tree in a fire, so it's a much higher quality snag habitat than kind of a snap stem from a hurricane disturbance. And so as a result, they might be initially useful for cavity nesting trees, but their utility both for foraging as well as for nesting decline pretty rapidly. Again, not a huge surprise, but bird species that require the canopy to nest. Obviously, when the canopy is largely blown over, you lose that community. On the flip side, what you gain are shrubland and woodland species. So this increase in kind of our early successional species, things like chestnut-sided warbler or golden-winged warbler, that are going to respond well to both some surviving trees. So I often need to emphasize we're looking at complex young forests, right? This isn't a completely cleared area. There's still legacies, both living and dead, in that forest, but there's a lot of open shrubland conditions that are favoring those species. And so again, just like with fires, a huge range of response depending on the guild of the species. A final comment on that, just in terms of gap phase dynamics, and I recognize that this is common sense in terms of what we're seeing here, but just to kind of draw the point that when we're looking at disturbance, even these gap scale events can have a pretty pronounced impact on the abundance of certain species on the landscape. And so here's some work from Poland that's comparing kind of bark beetle induced canopy gaps. So we're not talking about landscape scale bark beetle outbreaks. These are small gaps being created by insect outbreaks. And as one would expect, kind of that canopy mortality, the release of the understory, is resulting in kind of a higher abundance of ground nesting species. And likewise, that opening of the canopy and certainly the dead trees are also providing opportunities for insectivorous birds in those forests. And so those of you familiar with the Audubon program, Foresters for the Birds, a lot of the silvicultural strategies that are part of that really are trying to kind of restore and enhance some of these features, both in terms of understory cover, complexity and canopy gaps and so forth, and really getting into trying to emulate, excuse me, some of those post-disturbance conditions out there. So I'm going to pause for a question break here, and then we're going to transition from this really into thinking about, given our understanding of how important disturbance is for generating the structures and the compositional conditions that species need, how can we actually use that to inform silvicultural strategies that might be useful for managing biodiversity at different scales, and as well as in the context of adaptation. So I'll pause with a nice big legacy at the gap scale for questions, and certainly can take a couple, and then we'll keep rolling.
Great. Yeah, I wanted to just encourage people. I was just thinking, Tony, I had to prompt people to get a few questions in, but I have one. Well, I have two. One was link for your textbook, which I put there. And by the way, it has 5 stars on Amazon. So nice. Like, Good job.
Thank my mom for that review. No, just kidding.
Everyone's moms. Yep, we know how that works sometimes. What type of, this is from Rich, what type of disturbance is the rapidly expanding invasive pest hemlock woolly adelgid that is killing large stands of eastern hemlock in the Northeast? And then second part, are there replacement tree species that you would think about planting hemlocks? That's a good one for you.
Yeah, I mean, the hemlock, the way that that's progressing, of course, it depends on the abundance of hemlock in the system. And so in some cases, it could be more of a gap scale. So consistent with what we might expect, where we have, mortality of a pocket of hemlock. But if it's an entire stand, really it's almost this slow kind of stand level, infrequent, severe disturbance where we're having complete mortality of the canopy. And so when we think of that mortality and we think of the unique role of hemlock, both in terms of the structure of its even dead stems as well as the wood characteristics, leaving those legacies out there on the site is pretty critical in terms of just trying to sustain at least some influence of hemlock in that forest as long as we can. And then the replacement species piece, it's really tough depending on where you are and climatically, what other kind of long-lived, deep-crowned conifers you have. There's not a ton. In more northern environments, some of us think about red spruce as a species that can provide some similar habitat structure, but certainly not the scales that hemlock does. And there's actually been some work by Dave King and his colleagues looking at, believe it or not, Norway spruce plantations and looking at bird species that were historically reliant on hemlock and kind of their abundance in these Norway spruce plantations. And they've found that actually there's some consistency in those communities. Obviously, we don't get excited about planting Norway spruce anymore, but it's an example of trying to at least match some of the function, again, a deep crowned species that might provide similar habitat. But there really is no true replacement for hemlock. So trying to find at least some other conifer species that might be able to fill that niche is important.
Awesome. And then I'm going to take one more. There was one about one of the citations. Tony, do you have a bibliography at the end of your deck? Otherwise, I'll follow up afterwards.
Yeah, I can pass it. I can pass those along. No, I'm happy to. I don't have it at the end, but I'll definitely pass it along because those have been, yeah, great. And there's a couple other papers you'll see later on that you probably would want to take a look at too.
Okay, great. Thanks. Someone asked about one particular one. And then real quick, can you review and emphasize the difference between the last two of the disturbance archetypes you discussed?
Yeah, so the frequent gap disturbance, really those are ecosystems that they're predominantly dominated by, wind, ice, insects, disease, and really, those are occurring, as very frequently, and we don't have stand level and kind of stand replacing disturbances very often. So often the frequency of like a stand replacing wind event or a fire for a northern hardwood forest is 3 to 4 times the lifespan of those trees. And so, yeah, occasionally you'll have a big disturbance in a northern hardwood ecosystem, but it's extremely rare. And so as a result, you really get an uneven age forest that has kind of a complex mosaic of conditions. The heavy partial disturbance, you still, often might not have very frequent stand replacement disturbances, but they do tend to still occur. And when we do even have disturbance, it often tends to take, 40, 50%, 60% sometimes of that forest out. And so you have a lot of surviving trees, but there's a pretty dominant signature of those newer age classes within that. And so there's a lot of variability within that mixed severity regime. Red pine forests are one that we use as an example in the Lake States, but obviously kind of the Western conifer systems, there's quite a few that fit within that regime. But really we're talking about, you still have pretty heavy partial, like, again, up to 60, 70% of the canopy disturbed every 100, 150, 200 years, which is very different than what we might see with that gap scale regime. Awesome.
Yeah, that's great. Great. I'm going to let you keep going. This was a good question break with good scenery.
Good questions. Yeah, this is nice old oak there. So what we'll get into now is natural disturbance-based silviculture. So, we've kind of been talking about the role of disturbance in generating these habitats for different species. And really what I've been doing is kind of the setup for why we even think about natural disturbance-based silviculture. And so when we talk about natural disturbance-based silviculture, last December, I did an NCTC training on ecological silviculture principles. And really, when we're talking about natural disturbance-based silviculture, it's synonymous with ecological silviculture. Kind of a huge part of what we're doing with ecological silviculture is emulating kind of natural developmental models for forests. And so with natural disturbance-based silviculture, we're really trying to emulate aspects of a disturbance regime, both in terms of the frequency, the severity, kind of the spatial configuration of disturbances, as well as even the disturbance agents. So things like prescribed fire, and trying to make sure that we're emulating aspects of those, or even using those as tools. And the goal really is to create conditions. Obviously, we're removing some trees for wood products and other uses, but we're largely trying to use harvesting and modeling it in a way that's creating those habitat conditions that would have occurred following natural disturbance. And really the underlying hypothesis for this, and Mac Hunter and other wildlife biologists kind of put this forth years ago as really this coarse filter approach, that if we emulate natural disturbances with our management, we're likely creating those habitat conditions that are going to capture the majority of the native species in a region. And so that's really kind of an underlying justification for natural disturbance-based silviculture, and kind of why I was just showing you a bit about how wildlife responds to disturbance. So what are we being emulated? And I would argue that kind of the caricature of ecological silviculture in general, but also emulating natural disturbance regimes is this notion of leaving things behind. So leaf tree retention, legacy tree retention, whatever you want to call it, reserve trees, and really kind of this was a major shift from a paradigm standpoint from centuries of forest management where we're really focused on what we removed, to all of a sudden now really putting much more emphasis on what we're retaining, knowing just how important those living and dead legacies are as sources of habitat, often kind of as we often think of as lifeboats that can kind of carry more mature forest dependent species into a new forest. And so a lot of the discussion around leaving behind legacies is often centered on this pictures like this in the Pacific Northwest, where you have a clear-cut area that now has some large aggregates of retention trees. And so we often think of this as being done at the stand scale and retention at the stand scale. And that makes perfect sense in ecosystems where the archetype is infrequent severe disturbance, right? It's a big disturbance impact at a large stand level, and we're retaining those legacies. But in other ecosystems, we can also leave things behind. They just happen to be at the scales that disturbance occur. And so these pictures on the right are gap level retention of legacy trees within northern hardwood ecosystems, again, speaking to us understanding that things did not always completely blow over with a wind event. We would have trees that would survive within gaps. And so trying to emulate aspects of that with our retention. Likewise, when we think about retention, it's really about kind of retaining more than just kind of large mature trees or large old trees. It's also trying to sustain some of those key legacies that are going to influence future development in that ecosystem. So this picture here is from the Green Mountain National Forest, and so your eyes are largely drawn to the live trees being retained. Certainly, these pictures on the right here, some beautiful snags being retained. You might also notice in the foreground a bunch of beech has been felled, and so this is a forest where beech is pretty competitive, and so they're creating kind of a larger opening that better emulates more of what we consider a mesoscale kind of wind event, so kind of a bigger disturbance. But the reason I have this photo here is that it's also really protecting a key legacy in this forest, and that prior to harvesting this stand, there had been a pretty substantial accumulation of advanced regeneration of red spruce. And so through careful harvesting, they're actually protecting that legacy as well to carry that forward into the next stand and really serve as a key kind of conifer component in that ecosystem as it goes forward. And so it's not just kind of retention of big mature trees, but also trying to retain unique understory elements, as well as certainly kind of protecting advanced regeneration where it makes sense. One of the other things that we do with natural disturbance-based silviculture is that we often try to play catch up. And so if we think about a forest that's been developing for centuries under natural disturbances, it's really accumulated a lot of complexity, differences in tree sizes, differences in the distribution of canopy cover, gaps, areas that aren't gaps, areas that are dense, areas that have a kind of a mixed density of trees. And really what that complexity reflects is just a long-term history of disturbance. And so oftentimes with natural disturbance-based silviculture, we're trying to go into stands that are fairly young and try to accelerate some of that complexity through using silvicultural techniques that are introducing spatial complexity and heterogeneity with different intensities of harvesting across the site. So on the left, these are some images from Abe Wheeler at the BLM in Oregon. So we're looking at here, you can see outside these polygons, just fairly uniform, 40 to 50-year-old Douglas fir. And what they're doing with variable density thinning in these stands is really trying to quickly accelerate the spatial conditions and tree densities and gappiness that you'd have in 150 to 200-year-old Douglas fir forest. And so really trying to kind of accelerate the development of that complexity using variable density thinning. In this case, this picture below is in a more frequent fire woodland system in the Southwest, or using the individuals, clump, and openings, so ICO approach. Again, trying to really accelerate what was a very dense stand into a stand that now has that spatial complexity. And likewise, things like selection and irregular shelterwood methods often used to try to really kind of move along some of that complexity that accumulates over time in a forest under natural disturbance regimes. So the key part about emulating natural disturbances is that you need to have a good sense for what really is the range of severities and frequencies of disturbance that occur for a given ecosystem. And so this gradient in the middle from gap scale to catastrophic, this is some work that Justin Hart has been leading in the South, thinking about kind of the importance of these intermediate severity disturbances for generating kind of complex structures and certainly maintaining oak in those ecosystems. But really, it depends on what archetype you're in terms of both the severity and frequency of disturbance you might want to be emulating. And so below, I have everything from single tree selection ranging all the way to seed tree and clear cut with reserves. And those really correspond certainly to a gradient in severity in terms of our silvicultural strategies. And so even before thinking about natural disturbance-based silviculture, from a forest management standpoint, we've always had the opportunity to certainly implement different levels of severity and frequency of disturbance. But if I overlay the archetypes, those ecosystems really where gap disturbance, prevails, you're largely working with single tree group selection, as well as some irregular shelterwood methods that are very much creating those structures, and importantly, those severities of disturbance that really emulate that gap phase type system. Likewise, those working in more frequent low severity fire archetypes, again, in some cases group selection, but more often times some sort of irregular shelterwood type approach, that ICO approach, variable density thinning with the use of prescribed fire to really kind of emulate that intermediate severity that often occurs in terms of canopy density, but more importantly, giving us that spatial structure that's critical in those systems. Likewise, mixed severity archetype, moving a bit further down the spectrum here. So we're now talking about regeneration methods that would approximate a more heavy partial disturbance. So again, irregular shelterwoods, but also kind of grading into a bit of our more even-aged approaches with retention. And then finally, kind of that infrequent severe fire archetype. This is where we're now working in systems where we're creating fairly large openings, we're retaining trees in a range of configurations, but we're trying to emulate that early, what we call disturbance and legacy creation stage that happens at the stand scale and creates kind of this large scale impact and distribution of legacies across pretty broad extents. So when we look at areas and think about emulating natural disturbances, and certainly think through, how do we practice ecological silviculture, we've fallen into a trap historically where we look at a spot like this that maybe 40 years ago we might have just completely clear cut the stand and created a new even age stand. And now we know we want to be retaining legacies, retaining diverse seed sources, retaining patches of trees. And in many cases, some might say, all right, now I can collect my ecological silviculture merit badge. I have retained trees on the site. And what's important is that, simply retaining trees, just thinking about those legacies is not ecological silviculture. Really what we're talking about here is a long-term system for managing that forest, and really one that should be adaptive as well over time. And so this retention of trees, while emulating kind of what might follow kind of a large-scale disturbance on this site, is only the beginning of thinking about how this forest might develop over time and how we might treat that forest to try to sustain and restore some of those key functions that we're interested in. And so really what we want to be thinking about is a similar type of thinking that we do with traditional silviculture, and that is we have an ecological silvicultural system. And so similar to traditional silvicultural systems, this is a long-term sequence of treatments, but our focus is on restoration as well as maintaining, enhancing complexity, both compositionally as well as structurally on that site. And so what we're really using to guide that system, as opposed to what might be the best way to grow a given crop tree, instead we're really focusing in on what are the archetypes that I'm working with, what's the predominant disturbance regime, and how do I emulate that with my silvicultural strategies to achieve these habitat goals as well as other goals from that site. So certainly developing one that's unique to whether it's red pine or northern hardwoods or the pitch pine barrens here on the right-hand side. So if I was to do one for kind of northern hardwood forests, and so use a gap-based ecological system, And these ecosystems, really what I'm doing is emulating a disturbance regime that's fairly frequent, but low in severity. And so if I'm entering that forest, every 10 to 15 years, what I'm thinking about is what canopy disturbance rate am I trying to emulate? And then how do I emulate that with silvicultural strategies such that I'm creating kind of a disturbance regime that is at least within the realm of what historically occurs in that ecosystem. And so oftentimes with our northern hardwood resource, we're starting with the forest, like this picture here, that's fairly uniform. So 80 to 100-year-old second growth system. And so my initial entry is I'm really trying to kind of accelerate that complexity, that accumulated complexity that disturbance creates. And so using canopy gaps that would reflect what we know naturally occurred in these systems, but doing them at a rate that really is within that range of natural variation. And so if I'm going in every 15 years and creating gaps over 10 to 20% of the stand, I'm really roughly emulating kind of an annual disturbance rate of about 0.7 to 1.3% of the canopy. So really trying to emulate kind of what would make sense for that ecosystem, while at the same time trying to accelerate other aspects of that forest. And so this is not where it ends, right? We now think, well, into the future, what do I do in that system to further emulate that disturbance? And so creating additional gaps and further accelerating that stand's development into those much more uneven aged, irregular structures that historically existed in these ecosystems. And so trying to both focus in on restoring complexity, but importantly, that mosaic of conditions at the stand scale that really were the hallmark of these forests under natural disturbance regimes. And so thinking about the ways in which my silviculture comes together to do that. Likewise, this is ecosystem specific. And so this example I have on the screen is from Brian Palak's work, talking about how he would emulate a mixed severity regime in Great Lakes mixed pine forest. And so as opposed to that frequent gap scale event regime, we're now talking about ecosystems that have these heavy partial disturbances that are quite important, every 150 to 250 years. And so this silvicultural system begins with kind of that heavy partial disturbance, so a variable retention harvest, a regular shelterwood type approach, where you're kind of setting that forest back to a largely kind of a two-age condition. And then over time, really working to establish regeneration, kind of new cohorts. And then ultimately, once those cohorts are established, using things like variable density thinning to kind of accelerate some of that gap scale complexity that exists in those systems. So my reason for showing this is that, really the idea is that we're matching the silviculture to the site as we've always done. But what's critical for that matching is that we understand the ecological processes and importantly, the disturbance regimes that we're trying to emulate and how those fit in with the ecosystem. Finally, just one last comment on that. This is an example from Timo Kulovainen, where they were looking at circumboreal forests, both in Canada as well as in Finland. And the same idea, the upper panel is just describing how this forest is developing naturally, so following kind of a stand replacing disturbance, and kind of how that ultimately reaches this old growth phase where it's largely dominated by small gaps, as well as kind of more opportunity to return back to that early successional stage with fire. And so from an ecological silvicultural system perspective, really using things early on like variable density thinning to accelerate getting into this cohort and patch dynamics phase. And then likewise, as that kind of advances, ultimately getting into a period where we're using things like uneven age management to maintain that old growth condition. And so matching again, kind of what makes sense for those boreal systems to the silviculture, as opposed to just kind of using a single blanket ecological silvicultural approach. So one key comment about disturbance and ecological silviculture and just what we're doing in the landscape is that, with increasing disturbance regimes and increasing prevalence of severe events, and certainly hemlock woolly adelgid was brought up earlier in the questions, there's going to be more and more scenarios where we are faced with a decision over, do we salvage log and how do we salvage log and kind of recapture mortality following an event. And there's certainly economic reasons why individuals would want to do this, and as well as in some cases reasons why this might influence future disturbance behavior. And so there are certainly many justifications for salvage logging, but I want to talk about it just briefly within the context of biodiversity response and kind of making decisions about salvage logging. And in particular, when we look at reviews, and I'll provide this this paper as well, there was a global review of salvage logging impacts on a whole range of species. And so this figure on the left is everything from spiders to reptiles, and I'll focus again in on birds. So anything kind of to the left of this line is a negative response. And so there's certainly a range of responses, but the average trend for many species, particularly saprophilic species, so species that rely on dead wood, as well as many bird species, is negative. So whether it's post-fire salvage logging, post-storm salvage logging, post-insect salvage logging, there's been generally a negative trend, although certainly some exceptions to the rule. And really what we're seeing here, kind of two things. One, we're taking what is a key element of disturbance for biodiversity provisioning. So those legacies of disturbance, like dead trees, tip-up mounds, et cetera, and reducing their abundance. And so one example here, picture this angled stump actually is a tree that was salvage logged following a 1938 hurricane. And so those of you familiar with salvage logging following wind, it's definitely not easy work and quite dangerous work. And one of the reasons why it's dangerous work is that once this tree was kind of severed from the stump, the weight of that tree was no longer kind of keeping this as a tip-up mound. And so basically the tip-up kind of went back into the hole. And so even that salvage logging impact of kind of reducing kind of long-term microhabitat heterogeneity is going to influence on biodiversity. Likewise, salvage logging represents what we call a compound disturbance. And so the initial disturbance is the fire or the wind or the insect. And then we salvage log on top of that. And so we're creating kind of this double whammy disturbance that can really homogenize areas in terms of impact. And so we lose some of the heterogeneity in forest conditions at the standard landscape scale. And so when we're thinking about salvage logging, one of the things that's a bit frustrating is both with traditional forestry, but certainly with ecological silviculture as well, we focus so much on, future options for regeneration and future, options for crop trees and future options for legacies when the trees are alive. But once the trees are dead, all bets are off, and we just kind of go out and salvage and don't often think about it in terms of how do we do this in a way that thoughtfully leaves behind enough structures to sustain some of this diversity. And so a second review paper that was done by Thorne and others looking again at similar data sets really tried to get a handle on, well, how much unsalvaged area do we need to leave behind if we want to sustain those species that are adapting and responding to these disturbances. And so again, a wide range of taxa. I'm just going to focus in on birds on the top here. And basically what the x-axis is showing is just a percentage of unlogged area left and kind of and how well that's supported 90% of the diversity of species reliant on naturally disturbed habitat. And so what they found from that work is it really ranges, but basically 50 to 90% of unsalvaged area needs to be left behind to actually sustain some of these species that are unique to these disturbed habitats. And so as we're thinking through salvage, and again, grappling with the fact that we're going to have more and more big disturbances, factoring in how do we make sure we're retaining enough out there to sustain these species that are actually benefiting in some cases from these disturbance events across the landscape. All right, so I'll end the presentation here just talking briefly about adaptation and importantly, really kind of drawing some linkages between both the disturbance outcomes that naturally occur, but more importantly, that we're trying to emulate and in many cases restore to ecosystems, and how that is consistent with many of the factors that we now look to as conferring adaptation to future change. So when we look at emulating natural disturbances with silviculture, and again, more broadly, ecological silviculture, it's really been a shift in our management approach from one that was focused on historically homogenizing habitat conditions across areas really to maximize tree growth or maximize the production of a given wildlife species, to now creating a lot of within stand and cross stand complexity in terms of spatial arrangement of trees, tree sizes, tree composition. And these pictures here are just giving some representation of that. This retention harvest in the Sierra Nevadas, this regular shelter wood in northern hardwoods, this variable density thin and spruce fir up in the Conti Refuge. All of these, both pictorially and then the bottom panel showing via GIS maps, are reflecting just that fine scale, both spatial heterogeneity as well as complexity in forest condition. And so this was really guided by a desire to create a lot of habitats and a lot of opportunities for diversity. But when we look at it through the lens of adaptation, it also creates conditions that have a wide range of sensitivities to future change and disturbance. So differences in tree sizes, differences in canopy densities, open areas, dense areas, creating a range of vulnerabilities that might exist within a given spot. Likewise, we're creating a range of pathways and opportunities for both individual wildlife species, but more importantly, that forest community to both persist as well as recover and reassemble following disturbance. And so that complexity and some of those conditions that we've been creating with emulating natural disturbances are also certainly reflected in how we think about adaptation. And so a couple of simple examples, and then I'll wrap up. What we're looking at here is a variable retention harvest in red pine in central Minnesota. And so we're looking at kind of an aerial view of an area that was clear cut and what with retention. So we have kind of areas with denser retention, areas with scattered tree retention, and then to the north of this photo, an area that hasn't been thinned at all. And so really trying to emulate those structures that we would expect following a heavy partial fire disturbance in this ecosystem. And so if we look at it through the lens of climate change adaptation, we've done a lot of work examining individual tree species responses to climate change and how that's affected by the density of the forest that they're growing within. And what we've shown with red pine, the species we're looking at here, is that red pine growing in very dense populations is very sensitive to both fall temperatures as well as levels of precipitation in August. And so, you know, as you'd expect, these dense self-thinning stands quite sensitive to moisture availability as well as kind of late heat stress that might affect stored carbohydrates. We've also found the exact same species on the exact same site, if it's grown at a low density, is only really sensitive to warm fall temperatures. And so it really is kind of decoupled its sensitivity to the extreme precipitation events. And likewise, trees grown at a moderate density are primarily cued into summer temperature. And so what this is speaking to is that even though this range of densities historically is being created to emulate disturbance, historically being created to create a range of structures and habitats, it's also creating a lot of heterogeneity in the complexities that exist with the response to that forest to climate and disturbance. And so some of those attributes that come from ecological silviculture also are providing some opportunity for adaptation responses within a given species. Likewise, a lot of the work that's been done out west, examining approaches to restoration of fire-dependent ecosystems, it's certainly taken a range of strategies. And so the upper panel, and this is work from Derek Churchill, shows an area where they've kind of uniformly reduced fuels across the site. And so the panel on the right just shows that stem map. And so across that stand, we certainly have kind of created kind of stand-wide uniformity in spacing. And so the drought vulnerability is kind of the same. Wind vulnerability would be the same, as well as fire vulnerability. And if we look at kind of the understory environment, so the opportunity for new tree species, we've also created a very uniform environment in terms of light availability and moisture stress. And so really only a certain signature of species might be able to reestablish. The bottom panel is showing an area that was restored with the individual clumps and opening approach. And so you can really see that well in the stem map where we have some dense areas as well as open areas. And what that's created is certainly within that stand variability in drought vulnerability as well as wind and fire susceptibility. Likewise, kind of open areas that might favor more kind of intolerant and disturbance adapted species, as well as deeply shaded areas that might support more exposure sensitive species. And so creating that complexity, which again was historically in the name of restoration, also is creating some opportunities for adaptation in those ecosystems. And so I'll end with an image to burn your eyes, and many of you have seen me talk about this before, but we can't only rely on the past, right? When we think about adaptation, and there'll certainly be future webinars talking about the tools that are available to you. But when we're thinking about kind of how do we integrate more deliberate adaptation actions, so things like planting species or planting genotypes that might be more future adapted. So thinking about assisted migration or assisted population supplementation, how do we do that in a given landscape and use our understanding of natural disturbance regimes and the conditions they create as a way to guide that? And so this picture you're looking at here is a LiDAR image. So the hotter the color, the taller the canopy. And this is a part of the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change experiment that Maria and others at the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science have been so pivotal in guiding. And this happens to be at the New Hampshire site. And what you're looking at here, outlined in magenta, is what we call the transition treatment. And so what's happening in this area, this is a 25-acre area, is they're using a continuous cover or regular shelter wood that really is emulating kind of mesoscale wind disturbance. So creating 1 acre, quarter acre and 1 acre gaps, that what we would see following a wind event. And the reason why we're using that gap size is not only to restore some complexity to that forest, but it's also a gap size that makes sense for many of the species that are projected to be future adapted, because many of those actually are not that tolerant of shade. So things like red oak, certainly even less tolerant tree species like big tooth aspen. And so using an understanding of disturbance dynamics, what canopy openings make the most sense? And then can we use these places as kind of strategic locations where we might introduce new species or new genotypes, and that will ultimately interact with the remainder of this landscape that may not have planting occurring, but has this complexity of conditions that are being generated through natural disturbance-based approaches. And so creating what we call these micro stands that really will provide different ways for that forest to reassemble and adapt and provide those services that we're interested in over time. And so we can certainly rely on the past to kind of design these treatments, but we also need to be figuring out kind of creative ways to integrate some of these future approaches into that. So I'll end just by saying, certainly the reason why natural disturbance-based silviculture even was created as a concept was because many felt it was kind of the ideal coarse filter strategy for forest-dependent wildlife, right? It's going to create those conditions that our native species evolve with. And so can we do that with silviculture as a way to sustain them? Nevertheless, we can't just manage for the past. As I mentioned, we're going to have more and more kind of large-scale disturbances, novel disturbances like insect and diseases that are going to require us to be more thoughtful in what we do. And then that includes, if we're going to salvage, doing that in a way that's proactively thinking through how is this going to influence future distribution of habitat, as well as the adaptive capacity of that forest going forward. And to that point, even though we use like historic systems to ground these strategies, the conditions that we're creating, multiple size classes, multiple patch sizes, differences in composition and structure, all of those things also confer adaptation potential. And so these natural disturbance-based approaches really can be useful building blocks for these adaptation strategies that Maria and others are really advancing as we think about future climate change. So I'll end with that, and certainly happy to stick around for a bit and take any questions that folks have. Oh, Maria. I'm not hearing you, Maria.
Yeah, I apparently didn't hit the mute. Thanks so much, Tony. Great. Well, I'll let you, catch your breath. So just for folks, we had a pile of questions come in. They're fantastic. What I'm going to do is say, Tony said that he'd be able to stay late, but I think we'll just set a timer. We'll do a rapid fire 10 minutes maybe, Tony, and see what we get through. What I'm going to do is I see some themes, and so I'll try and pull together sort of some of those comments into some bigger themes where people have reiterated ideas. And also because there are a lot, and I think this is really like the value of explaining how cool silviculture is, there's a lot that are specific to silviculture that aren't necessarily related to climate change. And I don't think we're going to get to those just in the amount of time we have. So there are some cool ones related to revenue and other pieces, but it's kind of beyond the scope of this presentation. So I just want to set people's expectations. So yeah, I think, really kind of starting kind of towards the top, I think one of the questions was there were a number of questions related just changing in that disturbance frequency. And so, I have a couple versions of this question, or one of it is, this kind of idea, if you're moving from a low frequency disturbance to a high frequency disturbance, are you going to be able to maintain forests? How do you kind of manage that? There were a few questions about this idea of accelerated disturbance, and what does that mean in terms of being able to kind of even maintain systems?
Yeah, I think it's a real concern, as many of you are. I don't live in a region where that is a huge issue with our disturbance regimes, but certainly feel for those that are in those places now that are definitely approaching a threshold that, both either compounding disturbances, so many high severity disturbances in a short period of time, really are kind of eliminating both seed sources and creating extremely harsh and large scale conditions for trees to persist on. And so I think, in some cases, in those scenarios, one of the key challenges we might need to start shifting our expectations, in terms of what are we looking for in terms of, forest densities in these places. I think there's always been, even for some of our forests that did take 10, 20, sometimes 100 years to fully fill on a site, we all of a sudden want to see that in a year, just based on kind of our standards as well as some of our policies. And so I think trying to obviously, if you're managing it for timber or you're managing it for closed canopy species, it's easier said than done, right? You have a time frame that you're trying to achieve certain objectives within. But in many cases, I think we need to start accepting a wider range of variation in those systems, both in terms of the densities. And so maybe we're now shifting more towards woodland type structures in some of those forests that historically might have supported closed canopy conditions. And then in the context of those like woodland type forests that really, from a precipitation regime standpoint and fire regime standpoint, are now crossing this threshold where it's becoming challenging to even sustain tree species. Either thinking through other other species or other opportunities for establishing trees that might be adapted to that environment, or in some cases trying to again evaluate structurally, do we need to not expect there to be a certain density across an area that was historically supported 200 years ago under a very different fire regime. And so it's not a satisfying answer, but I do think we're hitting some junctures where we might need to recalibrate what our expectations are for those systems. But I would, I guess, put in with the caveat that certain things like dead trees being left behind and all those legacies, could be pretty critical for the reassembly of those systems and kind of what happens over time in those places. And so again, I recognize the need to salvage and certainly, to recoup economic loss, or in some cases, just some people just want those trees removed because they're dead. But there's certainly some work that's shown just how important, following some pretty severe and dramatic disturbances, that those legacies can serve as such an important nucleus for adaptation and reorganization. And so really focusing in on ways to maintain elements of that ecosystem, even if it's in a time of change. But I don't really have a satisfying answer in terms of, in many cases, it's a shift in what we were expecting from these forests. And in some cases, probably not falling in the same trap where we now run into these areas and need to get fully stocked stands back. If the disturbance regime and the climate is suggesting that's not something that can be supported into the future, we might want to be reevaluating what our benchmarks are and what we're using for those ecosystems to restore them.
Great. Yeah, I wanted to pick up that there was, I think you touched on this already, but kind of just to kind of cross a T on this one a little bit more, was specifically, the idea of like natural range of variation as being kind of something that, has in the past been used, and that ecological forestry, you are looking at those disturbance types associated with that. And so, any other sort of thoughts on how you can be informed by those dynamics, but also recognize that the disturbances are, like the disturbance regimes are different in the future? Like how are you kind of turning that corner? Yeah,
and so I think in many cases you're still, using an understanding of just how disturbances operated both in affecting, if we're going to focus in on trees, regeneration environments and structural development in those systems over time. And so, given a prevailing disturbance regime, a prevailing climate regime, the soils, et cetera, that's in a given site, those can really be helpful to sort through, for example, how does a mid-tolerant tree or, let's say a shade-tolerant tree, find its way into like a frequent fire forest system, or in the context of forests that we work in, how does a red oak show up in a northern hardwood forest? It doesn't make sense, given kind of the ecology and dynamics of those systems. And so using an understanding of those mechanisms, particularly going forward, if we're now, to your point, Maria, saying climate disturbance regime is now pushing the system much more towards one that might favor the prevailing regime that oak is adapted to. And so how do we use that as kind of a springboard into kind of a future regime where we're doing more with our silviculture that's emulating those conditions and trying to still sustain some of those structures that are, I think, key components of complexity as we're getting into adaptation. But we're kind of moving forward with kind of new species and new regimes that might better match that climate. And so I still view them, as a key way to kind of organize our thinking around the frequencies and severity of disturbance that might generate a given structure, but that we're always continually evolving kind of the thinking around, well, what species and what processes are going to become more dominant over time, and how do we either work with that or find ways to, if we can, direct things a certain trajectory if we're really excited about certain tree species, et cetera, on a site. So it's definitely not meant to be like, we use the term archetype, like this is a museum that we are trying to kind of recreate over and over again. I think what's nice about it is, if anything, it's a bridge towards what we're trying to do with adaptation. And so instead of kind of creating a whole new vernacular and a whole new terminology, a lot of what we're doing is taking like the base principles of ecological silviculture and just looking at them through a new lens, and to your point, kind of polishing them off to kind of modernize aspects of them. Well, yeah, maybe we can't keep managing for that structure because it's super prone to this new novel insect or this new, kind of fire regime that's happening in an area, or it's favoring certain species that seem to just not be doing well under a new precipitation regime. And so trying to find ways to adapt that going forward.
Great. All right. There were a number of there was a question and then multiple seconds of a question related to talking about the trade-offs between forestry, carbon mitigation, and wildlife. And so I did point people to noting that that was a specific talk in this webinar series, and so it's been touched on as far as a deeper dive from Todd Ontel in his presentation that people can see, but you've published in this, and so I wanted to give you a chance to weigh in on a couple key points you'd like to make, and I can grab that paper for folks as well.
Yeah, and I think, more broadly, and everybody recognizes this, carbon's kind of been I almost say we've almost like gone back to the 1940s when we're grappling with not being able just to manage for volume, and I think we've learned a long time ago that forests provide many benefits and can meet many objectives, and if you're going to try to just maximize one versus the other, there's going to be trade-offs with other objectives. And so carbon, I think, has become, rightfully so with forests, just given the outsized influence that forests play and as a natural climate solution. It's awesome, right? Another reason to celebrate trees. But nevertheless, there are certain management scenarios that may reduce kind of on-site carbon stocks if our goal is to restore complex young forests, and we're really trying to kind of sustain some of those species that historically would have been maintained by kind of large-scale disturbance agents like beaver activity or indigenous burning, depending on where we are in the landscape, that would have maintained more open habitats that just don't exist in certain areas. And likewise, as I was mentioning, our whole notion that we need to get a forest planted right away after it's disturbed, we don't have a lot of kind of this pre-forest stage in parts of the Northwest and elsewhere where that may have been more common. And so those situations aren't ideal from a carbon stocks on the site perspective, but they certainly provide measurable biodiversity benefits, as well as just from a kind of broader scale landscape resilience perspective. Instead of having kind of a common like high stock condition everywhere, having a diversity of structures, including young complex forest, old complex forest, middle-aged forest, open areas, really is creating that heterogeneity in conditions that will certainly influence just the vulnerability of a landscape to disturbance, as well as the vulnerability of a landscape to different climate stressors. And so when we look at trade-offs with carbon, there's certainly are key ones, but there's also things that we can do that, like, and I keep saying complex young forest, depending on the species you're managing for. I mean, many of our shrubland bird species still do very well on a site that has up to 5 to 10% of the canopy trees retained on them. And so, instead of going to like a purely open area in that scenario, leaving a few trees behind, like you're keeping a bit of that carbon stock on the site. And then likewise, over time, given just the sequestration ability of those areas, when they start hitting age 30, 50, 60, depending on the ecosystem type, they're often sequestering at the highest rate. And so we're kind of strengthening that sink at a broader scale. So it's a long diatribe on, there's trade-offs in any objective. And I think just carbon, just given the political and importantly, the global climate change significance of it, has become this objective where we're just looking at kind of in isolation. But forests are amazing. We get so many different things from them. And so we really need to be making sure that any objective isn't compromising other key values that we have, and certainly kind of our ethical obligation to sustain some of these species that historically were important and have kind of been lost, just given how we've changed the landscape.
Awesome. Great. Okay. So I'm going to give, I want to give Amanda a heads up if she can post information for contacting Jim, I think, to get the CFE credits. There was a question, so that'd be great to get that back out to folks because you can get continuing forestry education credits. And then Tony, my last question is, I think there were a couple of questions about just the being able to implement this and just like the practicalities of, invasive species coming into areas, potentially following disturbance or disturbances of different types, balancing, revenue with the fact that you're maybe doing more, retaining more on the landscape, and, safety, some of these other issues. And so I know you're implementing this sort of activities a lot more than, you're seeing a lot of implementation on this. So I wanted to see if you had any kind of thoughts on just kind of the real world practicalities of getting this work done on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, I think just like I mentioned with carbon, economics, there's certainly trade-offs, where you're leaving things behind. Sometimes trees that would, be trees that you would traditionally harvest. So there's always going to be economic trade-off with a silvicultural approach that emphasizes retaining these legacies. And I guess I maybe to start just with implementation, it's amazing. As much as I maybe 10 years ago hated people having handheld devices out in the forest, now it's, for many reasons, pretty amazing, including even implementation from an operational standpoint of some of these types of prescriptions where historically it's like, how am I going to mark all that area and really deal with like the substand to substand variation and gaps and thinning, and now with handheld mapping software and so forth, you saw a couple of examples of it. A lot of people are kind of shifting just to make it operationally efficient in terms of the time spent marking and kind of the ability of that operator to not have to kind of puzzle through 7 different colors of paint in terms of like, is this a tree I leave, is it a tree I top, et cetera. So I think, we've just become more operationally efficient with it. But as you brought up, there's certainly things that make it challenging to do any type of management, whether it's ecological silviculture or just traditional crop tree management in the form of invasive species, certainly pervasive impacts of deer browse, moose browse, elk browse, depending on the forest type that you're working with. And so, it is a bit challenging that some forests that we may have viewed as historically, for the lack of a better term, like easy to regenerate and manage, whether it's because of earthworms or invasives or deer on top of that, we're now looking at scenarios where it's going to be a cost. There's going to be some investment required, whether it's invasives control or planting species in places where we used to really reliably be able to get natural regeneration. And I think as we get into looking at even some broad policy and funding around carbon practices and things that can be beneficial to keeping forest and younger forest coming back in those places. Hopefully there'll be more and more opportunities and policies that are directed at those key bottlenecks, just to kind of reduce the financial burden of just doing any forest management independent of ecological silviculture that invasives present. But I think just broadly as it relates to the economics of it, obviously ecological silviculture is not for every single ownership, and in many cases when we look at like where most of our wood comes from globally. Right now, we're at about 46 to 47% of all of our wood comes from plantations. And so in many cases, those are the areas where there's a major input and major output of wood products. And so ecological silviculture and these approaches, often we're thinking about this applying to other landscapes where there's multiple objectives, there's possibly a mandate to satisfy multiple objectives, not just economic, and there's the opportunity to at least justify some of that lost revenue for other benefits that you're providing from that site. As well as maybe even be able to access clients and as well as markets that others might not be able to with just a strictly economic driven model.
Awesome. Thanks so much. It's always a lot of information from you, Tony. So
Too
it's
much,
great.
I'm sorry.
No, it's good, but I did put in the link multiple times. We'll work on getting that posted within a few days and send it back out and everything. But yeah, if people need to watch it on slow-mo, I totally get it. And there's great information. I appreciate everyone's time for joining. And thank you again, Tony.
Thank you all.